Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about the God of Epicurus. So let us begin. The Epicurus conception of God is influenced by, or at least is kind of part of the historical background for Epicurus is Aristotle. And Aristotle's conception of God is ultimately something like thought thinking about itself. And put that way sounds pretty strange, but in Aristotle's way of thinking, God is the greatest possible thing there is the greatest possible being. It's the most perfect, the most complete being there is. And as such, it is engaging in the better kind of activity, the greatest possible kind of activity that there can be. And that activity, because it's the greatest of its kind, so it's directed at the greatest possible object of that activity. So, what is the greatest possible thing there is? It's something like thinking thing, or thought, or mind. So, Aristotle's God is mind or thought, and is engaged in the greatest kind of activity. What is that? Well, it's thinking. Thinking is the greatest kind of activity there is in the universe. It's done by the greatest kind of thing, namely a mind or a thinking thing. And thinking is best when it's directed at better things. The greater the object of your thought, the better you thought. So the greatest thought you can have is a thought about God, because God is the greatest possible being there is. So the greatest possible being engaging in the greatest kind of activity directed at the best kind of object for that kind of activity turns out to be mind or thought thinking about itself. So there's this kind of cycle of self-thinking, actualization of thought by thinking about the greatest object of thought. So it's a kind of pretty cool picture. And that's the Aristotelian basic background or basic conception of God. And that influences Epicurus' way of thinking. Here's what Epicurus himself writes about God. Think of God as a living being. So that kind of cycle of thinking is a kind of life, the life of God, Aristotle would say, and Epicurus agrees. So God is a living being. He's imperishable, he cannot die. And he is blessed, he's happy. So the basic kind of the essence of God, as far as we can understand him, is as a living being that is incapable of death, that is immortal, that keeps on going, and engaging in the best kind of life that kind of being can have, and crucially to such an extent that it makes the being happy, right? So God is the happy being that is immortal, that is alive, that it perpetually continues this kind of perfect life. And Epicurus thinks that this is roughly along the main lines of the common idea of him. He's mostly referred back to Aristotle, but he thinks that some of the more kind of common believers have some sort of a rough idea along these lines as well. But Epicurus is aware that a lot of the common believers ascribe a lot more properties or descriptions or attitudes to God. And he cautions his followers to do this. He tells one of his followers, but attach to him, to God, nothing that is alien to imperishability or incompatible with blessedness. So Epicurus gives us a kind of principle for thinking about the nature of God. Think of God as a living being that is imperishable and perfectly blessed or happy. And do not attach any qualities or properties or attributes or things that are incompatible or at least in tension with that basic characterization of the nature of God. And it's going to turn out something crucial follows out of this. But here's another crucial observation about the way Epicurus is thinking, and like this is part of the Aristotelian tradition as well. So Epicurus thinks that every being seeks only what is good for them, right? So it is part of our nature to flourish and to develop, and we flourish and develop by attaining that which is good for us, right? That's just a natural kind of picture in the background. Um, and what's good for them is what makes them happy. So to flourish, to grow, is to seek that which is good for us, and that is what makes us happy. And the same thing is true of God. God only does or pursues that which fulfills him, that which satisfies him, that which makes him happy, that which gives him a life, a blessed life. So much like human beings and everything else, we naturally seek that which is good for us, the satisfaction of which is our happiness. And we should think of God that way too. Here's what follows from these two observations. And Kenny writes, the author of the book writes, the belief that endangers the gods' imperishable bliss is precisely the belief that they, the gods, take an interest in human affairs. To favor some human beings, to be angry with others, would interrupt God's life of happy tranquility. So the Epicurus conception of happiness includes this kind of peace of mind or tranquility. So according to Epicurus, all beings that attain that kind of flourishing state of the nature have reached the state of peace of mind and tranquility and peace. And that's essential to happiness. And that's true of God too. So here's how to put the pieces together. God only does the thing that promotes his happiness, and part of his happiness is this peace of mind and tranquility, this kind of serenity of being. In some things that common folk, common believers ascribe to God undermine that idea of God. And that is that God cares about human affairs, that God is angry with some people, that God is pleased with other people, that God is keeping track of the nuances of the human drama and the human activities, and that kind of like constant looking upon us, and he's kind of invested in their well-being, that he, cares for us and for some and not for others. And so on, that kind of divine investment in human activities, Epicurus thinks is incompatible with, at the very least, in tension with the peace and tranquility of perfect happy bliss, that is the divine life. So he thinks God is not like that. God does not care about human affairs. Why would he? Why should he? So here's the basic kind of principle of theology that Epicurus puts forth. Think of the nature of the divinity, right? Use your reason by grasping what it is to be God, in perfect blessedness, imperishability, and so on. Um, and nothing in it implies care for humans. There's nothing about seeking this life of tranquility and peace as that which is good for God that in any way implies that he would care about human affairs. In even worse, he says, everything in it implies indifference towards human affairs. Part of what it is that makes God happy and have this state of tranquility is precisely that he's not bothered by, he's not disturbed by other things that are happening outside of himself, like some external things, like namely that what humans do. Um, it would be a pointless distraction from the otherwise much more worthwhile activity of his peace of mind and tranquility, his happiness. It would detract from God's happiness to care about or be engaged with or be invested in human well-being. Why? Precisely because it's not part of it. God does not derive any benefit from that. And it's not the kind of thing that's conducive to his happiness. So it is foolish to think that God does care about human affairs. And this, of course, has drastic implications for the way we think about, for religion and so on. Here's something that Epicurus points to. Look at the world. Like, don't just trust my claim about God. Look at the world and see if it matches my conception of God, or the more popular conception of God in which God is invested, or like the polytheistic Roman Greek stories about the gods in which they're invested in human affairs. So it is folly or foolish to think that the gods created the world for the sake of human beings. What profit could they derive from our gratitude, right? So we are the creatures, we are made by gods. And then is the world made for us? Well, like a possible reason for thinking that is that we will be grateful and like offer sacrifice and worship and so on, prayers to the gods. But that seems to presuppose that our gratitude and our worship and so on somehow benefit gods. And of course they can, right? Like gods are beyond the kinds of beings that we can benefit. So it's not that the gods created the earth for the sake of us giving them something that they need or want or would benefit them in any way. And Lucretius, a follower of Epicurus, asks, does the world look like it has been made or created for the benefit of humanity? And he thinks obviously not, right? And the water, so here's this picture of nature. In the water, we can drown fairly easily. The big mountain, we get extremely cold and you cannot breathe that well because of the altitude. If you go into the wild, all of these animals that are wild that can eat us and can, in plants that can, we can be allergic to. But anyway, illnesses, a disease. If you just look around, it is not the Garden of Eden, right? The Garden of Eden, the place that is created for the well-being of humans, that is designed for humans to do well within it. The world is not like that. It is a lot more wild than that. It is not made for our needs, right? We can easily perish within it. In fact, people easily perish within it. it is inhospitable. At least much of it is inhospitable. This is within Earth that is much more hospitable for us. If you go outside of Earth, it gets a lot worse. So it's obviously not. It at least does not appear like the world is created for our well-being. Quite the opposite. We struggle a lot in it. And here's the implication that Epicurus thinks this has for religion in general. The sorry lot of humans, the sorry state of being, the human condition, is made worse, not better, by popular beliefs about the gods, by the popular conception of religion, which haven't changed all that much since his time. Impressed by the vastness of the cosmos and the splendor of the heavenly bodies, terrified by thunderbolts and earthquakes, we imagine that nature is controlled by a race of vengeful celestial beings, bent on punishing us for our misdeeds. We cower with terror, live in fear of death, and debase ourselves by prayer, prostration, and sacrifice. So the way, especially the religion of the time, the way that Epicurus thinks of the religion of the time, the popular religion, is something that debases the dignity of humanity. It makes it even more afraid, right? By thinking of nature as controlled by these divine forces that are kind of out there to get us and to punish us, and sometimes the whimsiness of the gods, push us around, and then we cower with terror. Then we pray and like try to convince the gods to be faithful to give us benefits and so on. Given that they don't care, that kind of way the religion itself debases humanity. It makes us worse off. It makes our sorry lot as humans even worse. But engaging in acts of sacrifice and prostrations to beings that don't care about us. So that has drastic implications for the nature of religion. However, this does not mean that Epicurus does not, or Epicureans do not believe in God, or think that we shouldn't worship the gods. Of course, we should. They think gods do exist, and we should worship them. But worship them does not mean like asking for favors. We should have a kind of piety. We should would respect or notice and worship the moral superiority of the gods, and that kind of worship should be stripped away from any superstition. And by superstition, Epicurus means something like trying to look at the world for signs to devise God's will for us, and like try to conform our lives to that will by trying to like look the way birds fly and things like that to see if that would indicate what we should do. Uh, as humans, that's a way of debasing ourselves because we abandon the fact that we're rational and capable of controlling our lives, that we undo the very kind of autonomy that gives us dignity by trying to point to signs that tell us what to do instead of thinking about it, taking control over our lives. That's part of the superstition. But another main part of the superstition, claims Epicurus, is the prayers to try to kind of move the will of the gods to give us more stuff, right? To offer sacrifices for the sake of getting benefits. That whole enterprise of giving stuff, and sacrifices for the sake of receiving benefits, Epicurus thinks all of that is superstitious. Why? Because the gods do not care about us, right? They're not the kinds of beings that are invested in our well-being. So we're just wasting resources, we're debasing ourselves, and we engage in superstition. The gods do exist, and we should worship them, but not in this kind of mercantile interaction kind of way, not by trying to manipulate them or like kind of engage in treatises with them and contracts and trying to negotiate stuff with them. That's not the kind of relationship we have to the gods, and that's the one we should have to the gods. It debases us and it mischaracterizes the nature of the gods, thinks the Epicurus. So what are the gods for the Epicurus? Well, they're not tangible or visible. They're not like on top of Mount Olympus, right? They're not sitting somewhere. They do not occupy space and time. They're outside of space and time, if outside is the right word. They're not material beings anywhere. And even one of the Epicureans, Epicurus himself does not say, but even one of them says something like, there is one God per every mortal person. I mean, that's weird to know exactly what that means. There is a contemporary, a modern interpretation of Epicurean gods that says something like, for Epicureans, gods are thought constructs or moral ideals to be imitated. So a single human thinks of what moral ideals look like, what the perfect version of, say, like humanity or at least moral agency might look like, and that is the god, right? their God is their own conception of what the moral ideal, the perfect being would look like, and then they try to imitate it. But deep down, that's it. It's just this human construct. It's just a thought in the mind of an individual person, and that's a modern interpretation of Epicurean theology. Um, it seems mistaken. It seems a little too modern. It seems a little too close to atheism for historical Epicureans. It does seem that historical Epicureans have, like, they do believe in gods, like real, existent outside of the human mind. But they're kind of very distant from human affairs, and our religious practices, they think, should incorporate the distance that the gods have towards us, much like the lives of the ants should incorporate the distance that their lives have to the lives of humans, right? And shouldn't be making all of these like offerings to humans, so humans stop by and give him, like, pieces of candy or something. We don't even notice, right? At least most of us don't even notice, right? We're doing our thing and then we're trying to be happy ourselves. And the ants are there somewhere, but it's not like their activities or drama affects us at all. We don't even notice. Something like that happens with humans and the gods. We should worship them and recognize that they're great, but not try to manipulate them and engage in those superstitious activities as Epicurus understands them. Okay, let's end here. I'll see you next time. Bye.